In the summer of 1683, Europe stood at the edge of collapse. An empire unlike any the continent had seen was moving toward its greatest prize. Vienna, the last gate to the heart of Europe, was surrounded.
Outnumbered, starving, abandoned, yet unbroken.
Confident of victory, the Grand Vizier believed time itself would deliver the city to him.
But across Europe, an answer came, led by a king who would ride at the front. September 12th, 1683. History was about to change forever.
What happens when the fate of an entire continent rests on the walls of a single city? In the late summer of 1683, this question was not an abstraction, but a brutal reality for Europe. Vienna, the proud capital of the Habsburg Empire, stood on the edge of destruction. To its east, the Ottoman Empire, one of the most formidable powers in the world, had assembled an army so vast that the ground seemed to tremble beneath its march. Whispers had circulated for months. Merchants along the Danube spoke of caravans of soldiers, churches feared desecration, and villages reported the approach of foreign banners. At first, it seemed like rumor, but by June, smoke rose from razed towns, and reports confirmed what many dreaded. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was leading an army, perhaps 150,000 strong, though chroniclers would later exaggerate the number to nearly 300,000. Toward Vienna, this host was not merely a force of numbers, but of diversity and terror. At its core marched the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, seasoned in countless campaigns. Cavalry in glittering armor, the Sipahi, rode beside the swift and fearsome Tatar horsemen, notorious for their cruelty. Siege engineers followed with massive cannons, timber and sappers skilled in undermining walls. The advance was unstoppable, devouring all in its path. Cities that resisted were obliterated. Those that surrendered were spared but drained of men and resources. By July, the banners of the Crescent had appeared on the Austrian frontier. Inside Vienna, unease turned to panic. Though a fortress with stout walls and bastions, Vienna's garrison was alarmingly thin. Emperor Leopold I, fearing capture, abandoned the city on July 7th, retreating westward to Linz. Nobles and officials followed, leaving behind a desperate garrison of only 15,000 soldiers and 5,000 militia. At their head stood Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a commander of iron will, just 36 years old, burdened with the impossible, to hold Vienna until help could arrive. On July 14th, the Ottoman vanguard appeared before Vienna. By the 17th, the city was encircled. From the hills, an ocean of tents stretched across the plains. At its center glittered Kara Mustafa's pavilion, more palace than camp, adorned with fountains and carpets, a striking contrast to Vienna's battered defenses. Kara Mustafa was supremely confident. He did not intend to storm the walls in reckless fury. Instead, he would choke the city into submission through hunger, fear, and relentless bombardment. The siege began. Artillery thundered day and night. Mines exploded beneath bastions, toppling towers into ruin. Food dwindled. Water grew scarce. Disease spread among the crowded civilians who huddled in cellars and churches. Yet, under Starhemberg's command, the defenders clung to their resolve. Civilians and soldiers alike patched crumbling walls, fought fires, and launched daring sorties to burn Ottoman siege works. Women and children carried stones and ammunition to the ramparts. Against the mightiest army in the world, Vienna resisted. For nearly 2 months, the city endured, but each passing week drew it closer to collapse. Kara Mustafa tightened the noose, confident that no relief would arrive in time. And yet, far beyond Vienna's walls, a cry for aid had already echoed across Europe, reaching kings, princes, and even the Pope in Rome. The siege of Vienna was no longer just about a city. It had become the front line in a struggle for Europe's very survival. Would the city fall before help could come? Or would an unexpected alliance change the course of history? To understand the battle for Vienna, one must first meet the figures and forces who shaped it. History often remembers wars as clashes of armies, but in truth, it is the people who stand at the heart of destiny. In 1683, they came from every corner of Europe and beyond, bound together, some by ambition, some by faith, and others simply by necessity. At the center of the Ottoman advance stood Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. Tall, imposing, and brilliant in strategy, he embodied the pride and ambition of the Ottoman court. He was not merely a commander, he was the Sultan's trusted hand, entrusted with expanding the empire's dominion into the heart of Europe. Yet beneath his confidence simmered a dangerous flaw: arrogance. He believed Vienna would fall as Constantinople once had, not by storm, but by sheer inevitability. His refusal to unleash his full force in a decisive assault revealed both his patience and his hubris. Facing him within Vienna's walls was Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a man of iron discipline and courage. At only 36, he bore the weight of a city's survival on his shoulders. Thinly supplied, outnumbered nearly 10-1, Starhemberg rallied soldiers and citizens alike. His words carried the promise that Vienna would never yield. His leadership transformed bakers, merchants, and even children into defenders, reminding the world that courage is not born of numbers, but of will. Beyond Vienna's walls, another figure was stirring: King John III Sobieski of Poland. To his men, he was no distant ruler issuing orders from a gilded palace, but a commander who rode among them, sharing their hardships and their dangers. He was already renowned for defeating Ottoman forces at the Battle of Kotin a decade earlier. When he declared, "To save Vienna is to save Poland," he shifted the fate of nations. Sobieski embodied both chivalric valor and tactical genius, and he would soon play the role of savior. But kings and generals alone could not decide Europe's destiny. Ordinary people bore the true cost. Within Vienna, women carried buckets of water to douse fires from cannon strikes, while children hauled stones to reinforce walls. Priests offered comfort in the cathedrals, where civilians huddled during bombardments. Every citizen became part of the garrison, a living testament to unity in crisis. Outside, diplomacy and faith shaped the response to Vienna's plea for help. The Holy Roman Empire, fractured into many states, struggled to unite. But the voice that rose above political division was that of Pope Innocent XI. From Rome, he declared the siege not merely a political struggle, but a holy war, a defense of Christendom itself. His influence, persuasion, and financial aid forged what became known as the Holy League, a coalition of kingdoms and duchies willing, at last, to put aside rivalries for survival. Thus the stage was set with an unlikely cast: an arrogant vizier, a steadfast count, a warrior king, and a pope who bound the fractured pieces of Europe together. Alongside them stood countless unnamed men and women whose courage would never be recorded in chronicles, but whose sacrifices ensured the city endured. The fate of Vienna and of Europe now rested in the hands of these characters. Soon, their choices would collide in a storm of fire, steel, and blood. But how would these alliances hold when confronted with the greatest siege Europe had ever seen? The summer of 1683 dragged into a brutal stalemate. By August, Vienna was little more than a city under torment. The air shook with the ceaseless pounding of Ottoman artillery. Mines carved beneath bastions erupted in thunder, sending towers crashing into rubble. Smoke and ash painted the skies. Yet, behind battered walls, the defenders refused to yield. Each breach was filled with rubble and flesh, every advance met with desperate counterattacks. The siege had become a war of attrition, a contest of endurance between the world's greatest empire and a city abandoned by its emperor. Starhemberg's men fought on the edge of despair. Food was scarce, bread rationed into crumbs, water from the Danube was cut off, disease crept through the overcrowded quarters, civilians cowered in cathedrals, praying as cannon fire shook stained glass windows. But in the midst of ruin, Vienna's spirit burned. Women carried ammunition to the walls, children fetched stones for defenders, priests blessed soldiers before sorties. The city became one body, united in defiance. Outside, Kara Mustafa grew increasingly frustrated. His strategy of slow strangulation tested the patience of his own army. His commanders urged a full assault, but he resisted, unwilling to gamble his prestige on a costly storm. He believed time itself would deliver victory. In his vast pavilion adorned with silks and fountains, he dreamed of parading through Vienna as its conqueror. But arrogance blinded him, for even as he tightened the noose, help was approaching. Beyond the hills, word of Vienna's plight had shaken Europe from complacency. Pope Innocent XI had rallied the powers of Christendom into a fragile coalition, the Holy League. Dukes, princes, and generals reluctantly put aside rivalries, answering the call not only of politics, but of survival. And leading them with unmatched vigor was King John III Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski had gathered some 70,000 troops, Poles, Bavarians, Saxons, Austrians, and more. A patchwork of Europe, divided by language and culture, yet united by the threat at Vienna's gates. Their march was long and brutal, through mountains and rivers, but their spirits were lifted by Sobieski's presence. To his men, he was not only a king but a comrade in arms, sharing their hardships in the saddle. His arrival would be the miracle Vienna prayed for. On September 10th, Sobieski's army reached the hills above Vienna. From the wooded slopes of the Kahlenberg, he looked down on the besieged city. Smoke rose from crumbling bastions. Ottoman banners stretched across the plains in an endless sea of silk and steel. Yet still, Vienna stood. Time had not broken its spirit. Sobieski knew the moment of reckoning had come. The plan was bold. Allied forces would descend from the hills in a sweeping arc. Imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine would press the Ottomans from the left. German contingents would drive through the center. And Sobieski himself, waiting with the might of 20,000 cavalry, including the legendary Polish winged hussars, would hold the right flank, hidden until the decisive moment. It would be the largest cavalry charge in European history. The morning of September 12th dawned with tense silence. The siege guns still roared, but now their thunder was answered by distant horns and drums. From the forests above Vienna, banners of the cross emerged. The relief army had arrived. Kara Mustafa scoffed. He believed his massive host could crush both the starving city and its would-be saviors. He would learn too late the folly of underestimation. The battle for Vienna had begun. The walls that had endured for 2 months would now become witness to a clash that would decide not only the fate of a city, but the destiny of Europe itself. How would the desperate defenders and the coalition of Christendom turn the tide against such overwhelming might? The dawn of September 12, 1683, broke over the ridges of the Kahlenberg with an ominous silence. Below, the Ottoman camp stretched across the plains like a second city, its banners fluttering in the morning wind. Vienna's walls still stood, battered yet unbroken, while inside the city, exhausted defenders braced themselves for what they believed might be their final day. But high in the wooded hills, an army stirred, a coalition of Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and more, gathered under the command of John III Sobieski. By mid-morning, the first clashes erupted. Charles of Lorraine's imperial troops struck the Ottoman left, forcing back forward units and disrupting siege lines. German contingents advanced through the forests, musket fire rattling as they clashed with Ottoman outposts. For hours, smoke and gunfire filled the valleys. Vienna itself joined the fight, with Count Starhemberg ordering sorties against Ottoman trenches, setting fire to siege works and distracting their enemies. The defenders, half-starved and weary, fought with renewed vigor, knowing salvation was within sight. Kara Mustafa underestimated the danger. Confident in his numbers, perhaps 120,000 strong, he believed the relief force would shatter upon his entrenched positions. He threw Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry into the fray, determined to hold the ridges and crush the Allied advance. The fighting grew desperate. Cannon thundered, volleys of musket fire tore through ranks, and cavalry clashed in sweeping charges. Yet, the Ottomans began to falter under the relentless pressure. As afternoon turned to evening, the tide shifted. The Allied left and center pressed forward, driving the Ottomans back toward their sprawling camp. But the decisive blow was yet to come. On the right flank, hidden until now, Sobieski readied his cavalry. Nearly 20,000 horsemen stood poised. Polish winged hussars with their gleaming armor and eagle-feathered wings, alongside German cuirassiers and other heavy cavalry. At their head rode Sobieski himself, placing his crown and life on the line. As the sun dipped low, Sobieski gave the signal. Trumpets blared, hooves thundered, and the hills shook as the greatest cavalry charge in European history began. Down the slopes of the Kahlenberg they poured, wings rattling with an eerie hiss. To the Ottomans, it was as though angels of death had descended from the heavens. Their lines buckled, Sipahi cavalry scattered, and Janissaries, once unshakable, were broken beneath the avalanche of steel and horseflesh. Sobieski's charge smashed directly into the heart of the Ottoman camp. Panic erupted. Kara Mustafa's pavilion, once a symbol of grandeur, became the center of chaos. The Grand Vizier himself fled in haste, his command dissolving around him. What had begun as a confident siege now unraveled into a rout. Soldiers abandoned cannons, supplies, and banners in desperate retreat eastward. The mighty host that had encircled Vienna dissolved into fragments. From the city walls, the defenders watched in awe as the tide turned before their eyes. Exhausted, hungry, yet unbroken, they erupted in cheers. Vienna had been saved. The cross had withstood the crescent. The nightmare of conquest had become a miracle of survival. The consequences were immediate and profound. The Ottoman army, once feared as an unstoppable force, suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in its history. The siege of Vienna was broken, and with it, the dream of Ottoman expansion deep into Central Europe. The psychological blow was as devastating as the military one. The myth of invincibility shattered. Yet amidst the jubilation, Europe faced sobering questions. Would this fragile alliance, the Holy League, hold together beyond the victory? Could the momentum be sustained? Or would old rivalries resurface now that the immediate danger had passed? The battle was over, but its aftermath would ripple across empires, shifting the balance of power for generations. What lessons would Europe draw from the ashes of Vienna's siege? And how would this victory shape its future? The thunder of hooves and clash of steel had faded, but the Battle of Vienna left echoes that would resound across centuries. For the Ottomans, the defeat was not just military, it was symbolic. The myth of unstoppable expansion, nurtured since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, was shattered. Europe, once divided and fearful, had found the strength to stand united. And from the ashes of Vienna's siege rose lessons and legacies that endure even today. The first lesson was one of unity. The Holy League was far from a natural alliance. The Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Bavaria, Saxony, and the papacy often quarreled more with one another than with their enemies. Yet in the crucible of Vienna, these rivalries were set aside. Pope Innocent XI's vision of a united Christendom proved that survival required cooperation beyond borders and ambitions. It was a rare moment when faith, politics, and necessity aligned. Second, the battle revealed the power of leadership. Kara Mustafa Pasha's arrogance and hesitation doomed his campaign. By refusing to storm Vienna decisively, he gave the defenders time and his enemies hope. In contrast, John III Sobieski's courage, decisiveness, and personal presence among his men inspired both soldiers and allies. His legendary charge, leading the winged hussars down the slopes of the Kahlenberg, became an eternal symbol of bravery. Starhemberg, too, within the city, embodied resilience, proving that steadfast defense could withstand even the fiercest storm. The legacy of Vienna extended far beyond the battlefield. In the years that followed, the Holy League pushed the Ottomans steadily back, reclaiming Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Balkans. The empire that once loomed over Europe now began a slow retreat. The Siege of Vienna thus marked the beginning of the Ottoman decline in Europe, a turning point in the continent's balance of power. Culturally, the battle left curious imprints. It is said that fleeing Ottomans abandoned sacks of coffee beans in their camp, which Viennese locals discovered. Soon the first coffee houses opened in Vienna, blending Eastern tradition with Western taste. The croissant, too, was born in commemoration of victory, a pastry shaped like the crescent moon of the Ottoman flag, eaten as a sweet triumph over the invader. Even today, when one sips Viennese coffee or enjoys a buttery croissant, they unknowingly taste the legacy of 1683. The enduring value of the battle lies in its reminder of resilience. Against overwhelming odds, a city held firm. Against overwhelming armies, alliances prevailed. It showed that even the mightiest force can falter when faced with unity, courage, and determination. Vienna became more than a city saved. It became a symbol of Europe's survival and renewal. Yet the story is not one of unbroken triumph. For while victory preserved Christendom, it also deepened divides. The battle reinforced religious boundaries between East and West, Muslim and Christian, Turk and European. These fractures would echo in centuries of mistrust, conflicts, and cultural misunderstandings. Vienna's salvation was both a triumph and a tragedy, marking the limits of tolerance in an age of empire and faith. Today, when we walk through Vienna's grand avenues, past Baroque palaces and coffee houses, we walk through the living memory of 1683. The lessons of resilience, leadership, and unity endure. But so too does the reminder that peace is fragile and survival often demands sacrifice. What then does this story mean for the future? Can we learn from the courage of those who stood at Vienna's walls and the cooperation of kingdoms that once set aside pride for survival? The guns fell silent, but the echoes of Vienna's salvation reverberated across centuries. The Battle of 1683 was not just the conclusion of a siege, it was a hinge of history, a turning point upon which Europe's destiny swung. The city had survived, the Ottoman tide had been stemmed, and Christendom breathed once more. Yet as with all great victories, the story did not end there. It rippled outward, raising questions that remain relevant to this day. For the Habsburg Empire, Vienna's survival meant resurgence. The Austrians not only secured their heartland, but also began pushing back Ottoman influence in the Balkans. Within decades, territories once thought lost forever were reclaimed. The memory of Vienna gave the Habsburgs a unifying myth, that of a fortress civilization, standing firm against the world's storms. For Poland, King John III Sobieski became a legend. His charge down the Kallenberg would echo in song, poetry, and painting, immortalizing him as the Lion of Lekistan. Yet his triumph was bittersweet. Though celebrated as Europe's savior, Poland's internal divisions would soon resurface, and within a century, the kingdom itself would be partitioned out of existence. Victory could win glory, but not always stability. For the Ottoman Empire, the defeat was a crack in its armor. Though still powerful, the empire's aura of invincibility had been shattered. The loss at Vienna signaled the beginning of a long retreat from Europe, culminating centuries later in its collapse after World War I. Kara Mustafa Pasha, disgraced, would meet a grim fate upon returning to Istanbul, a reminder that empires, like men, stand or fall by their choices. And yet, beyond dynasties and empires, the deeper legacy of Vienna was one of unity in diversity. Europe, often fractured by rivalries and religious wars, had found a way, however briefly, to stand together in defense of a shared future. Sobieski, the Pope, the Habsburgs, the German princes, the Bavarians, all had set aside their disputes to forge a coalition. In this sense, Vienna was more than a military victory. It was proof that cooperation, though difficult, could overcome even the gravest threats. But the story also leaves us with haunting questions. How fragile is unity? What happens when the urgency of survival fades and old rivalries re-emerge? The alliances forged in 1683 did not last. Europe would again be consumed by wars of ambition, succession, and revolution. The lesson of Vienna, that survival depends on solidarity, has been learned and forgotten many times over. And so, as we look back, the Battle of Vienna becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror. It asks us, in our own age of division and uncertainty, would we find the same courage to unite against common dangers? Would leaders today ride to the front, like Sobieski, when the hour of decision strikes? Would ordinary men and women endure hardship with the same resilience as Vienna's citizens? The cannons have long gone silent, but the questions remain loud. The gates of Vienna may no longer tremble under siege, yet the gates of our civilization, whatever we define it to be, always stand before challenges. The answer to Vienna is not merely in the past, it is in the choices we make now.